Welcome back to Rethinking Politics. We're glad to have you. I have to apologize. Dan is gesturing like a madman on his camera while I'm trying to start the podcast. And we're not gonna start over again. We're just gonna keep going. Welcome back to Rethinking Politics.
Thank you.
We're glad to have all but one of you here with me today, and it should be good. Last week we talked about greedflation, the rising theory that inflation is not a result of a growing supply of money, but is rather a result of greed. And we talked a little bit about that theory and cited an article discussing it. And this week, as promised, we're going to be presenting the Austrian economic theory in its partial glory, because there's just so much there. We're going to cover as much as we can and then work to apply that to what's going on in the world today. And when I say we, I want to be clear that I'm mostly talking about me, because Dan has not stopped just goofing off on camera.
This is the advantage of us not recording camera, right? I can actually just do like the YMCA.
He can look as stupid as he wants, and the only result is me being unable to say anything intelligent. So,
which is to say, it's a normal podcast.
So it's no problem. At least
I'm
now
not sure
I
why
have
you're
an
complaining.
excuse.
That's right. It's funny you mentioned the greedflation episode. I since have heard a poll. I was surprised to find that how many people are willing to accept that explanation. I mean, not that it should be a shock that corporations are raising their prices in part because they want to make more money, right? That's a thing. And so I guess it's not that surprising that people believe it. But the concept of greedflation is meant to really be a fundamental shift in the way we view economics. They've taken something that seems like an obvious explanation as part of it, but by giving that priority, they're really changing the way we think of economics. Mm-hmm. But as you said, today we're going to be addressing how we think of economics, not worry about the other disciplines, not try and do some comparative thing, not try and dance. It's really hard with a limited amount of time to do justice to multiple ideas and sitting down.
Just I'm not a good dancer to begin with, but seated's even harder.
I see. Well, those of you out there, feel free to dance to this podcast.
Who needs music? So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to be basing our explanation of Austrian economics loosely or not loosely, depending on how it goes, on a book written by Murray and Rothbard many, many years ago. And the book is called Man, Economy, and State. And for those of you who are familiar with this book, it is a whopper, something like 1,000 pages long. It's very dry, and it's very difficult to read, while also being incredibly easy to read at the same time. So, depending on who you talk to, I thoroughly enjoy it. But what this book attempts to do is it attempts to look at the Austrian economic theory, not in a philosophical way, like someone like, Mises did in the past. He's one of the guys who came up with these fundamental ideas, and so he's feeling them out and seeing, okay, well, what about this and what about this, and trying to defend these main ideas. Rothbard's coming in later and saying, okay, we have all these ideas that together form this economic theory. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put them all in one place, and in an almost Euclidean fashion, start from point A and build up the theory.
The Euclid comparison is, I think, really useful. If you're not familiar with Euclid did he was the geometry guy, the Greek geometry guy that famously people like Abraham Lincoln would carry his works around and study them to learn argument, to learn logic. Because Euclid would if you think of geometry and you're thinking numbers, there are no numbers in Euclid. It's all propositions. It's logical propositions that build on one another to explain geometrical truths that are true regardless of the numbers, right? This isn't a demonstration of the numbers. It's the theories behind them, and that was based in logic. If you want to learn logic, I would say this is my assertion is that Rothbard is the greatest teacher of logic. This book particularly is going to be the most useful treatise on logic that you're going to run into, because it attempts to do exactly what Euclid was doing. It does it on a much wider scale. Mm-hmm. It's a verbal logic in an attempt to, as Brad said, establish certain axioms, things that are self-evidently true, and then build from there in a deductive process, which, to the degree that it's effective, is true because it's deductive, right? Deductive being, if you learn something by deduction, if you learned anything from a Sherlock Holmes movie, it's that he doesn't know what the word deduction means. Because deduction, when done properly, is 100%. Whereas he's playing probabilities almost all the time, right? It's like,
and running around a lot and fighting people.
That's the movies, yes. There's a bizarre amount of action that apparently is all fueled by deduction. But anyway, we digress.
We
as
digest.
Usual. We do that as well. Unintentionally.
So, Austrian Economics starts with one single point, and it's that it's a study of human action. And what that means is human action is purposeful action that someone uses to achieve an end. So Dan, what are some examples of human action?
Human action, us making a podcast. Human action.
No, I said purposeful. Something to achieve an end.
This is you suggesting what we're doing is an accident. It's unintentional. We're mere animals behaving with that.
Is that Rothbard makes it very clear in this book that basically every action that you or I take is driven by a desire. That there's something that we want to have happen at the end of that. And we believe that doing something will result in that desire. And I'm saying that is not our podcast. That it's almost a universal thing. You know, that basically anything you or I do is purposeful action. Except for one.
Except for one. Yeah, so another way to express this is people use means to achieve ends, right? An end is the goal. Means is the action or thing that you do to achieve that goal. You're hungry, you get some food. You're tired, you sleep. You want to feel less stressed, you turn on the TV, or you call your friend, or you do whatever you do. You crack open the bottle, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. That every action is fueled and often unconsciously, right? Where you don't have to deliberately be like, what do I want and how do I get it? Mm-hmm. Often it's so automatic what we do.
No, and a great example of that would be you're lying in bed and you're supposed to get up. You've got things you need to do that you know that you should be doing, and you don't want to do them, and so you stay in bed. And so you might argue, no, I wasn't acting to achieve an end. In fact, I was doing the opposite. I was specifically choosing not to act and to not achieve my ends. But in reality, what's happening there is that you looked at all of the things you needed to do that day, or at least the first thing you were going to do that day, and you said, I would rather stay in bed for 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes or all day than do those things. And so your new end was in fact staying in bed. Or maybe it wasn't even staying in bed. Maybe your new end was specifically not doing those things. And so you stayed in bed was the means. But for me, it's usually the staying in bed is the end, not the means. But it depends. It depends. Everyone is different. And so that's the thing. So there's a few key elements here to human action. The first one is that only individuals can act. because only individuals can have only individuals are human. There is no such thing as a creature that's made up of 10 people. And so 10 people can act together to each achieve their own ends that happen to align with each other, but they're still acting individually to achieve their own end. You know what I mean? So if I'm marching in a parade with a whole bunch of people to protest gay rights, we are not group acting. We're all individually there for our own reasons, and they're usually quite varied. You know, if you go to a gay rights, protest or parade, everyone there is not going to be like, oh yes, the end I'm trying to achieve is gay rights as an elusive concept. They're going to have much more specific reasons for why they're there. And in this case, the means may be the same, showing up at this event, but it doesn't mean that they're individuals who are individually acting. So
but
that's
they're
the
not
first
individuals who are individually acting.
They're individuals who are individually acting together.
Yeah, because you could say, why did Congress pass this bill? And to answer that question and to really understand it, you'd actually have to look at them as individuals. Mm-hmm. You'd have to say, why did so-and-so pass this bill?
In fact, that's how most bills are passed, is by people looking at the individual motivations of the people they need to get the vote passed.
That's right. You want to move politics, you got to get into that level and start figuring out why people are doing what they do and start working with them from there. Yeah.
So the next thing you need to have is a desire for something to be different. You know what I mean? That things are, you've got an environment that you're in, and the environment's different for everyone. And if you are perfectly happy with everything that's taking place in that moment, then you won't act. Of course, at that point, you're choosing inaction in order to continue to get the end that you want, which is the current state of things. But assuming your choice isn't inaction, then what you have to desire is something different from how things currently are. You know, whether that's you want to be standing instead of sitting, or whether you want, you want to eat instead of not eat, etc., etc. And those desires can become much more complicated. You know, it could be that you want, a Toyota RAV4 with the XSE trim and the extra moonroof package. You know what I mean?
Did you just start speaking in another language? What is
it? Toyota RAV4 XSE with the moonroof package. I'm assuming
I just learned something new about Brad.
I'm assuming that's not something you desire, Dan?
I don't even know. I mean, I can imagine what that might be. A moonroof. Is this like solar power, but by the moon?
So I've actually been recently explained this. Is the sunroof is when it's over the front part of the car, the driver's, and the moonroof is when it's farther back. I don't know why a moonroof would be desirable over a sunroof, but they're pretty popular now. I see many models of cars that have moonroofs instead of sunroofs. That's what I was told about the difference between a moonroof and a sunroof. I'm not a roof person, sun or moon, and so I wouldn't know.
We've checked that box now, and we're probably not going to talk cars again. So if that's what you're here for, join us next time.
Wait, we talked about
for
cars
the economics.
Next time? So I think what Dan's trying to say here is move on, Brad. Move on, even though he was the one who made me stop and clarify. So you have the desire, and then the next thing, or the ends, and the next thing you have is the means. And the first thing about means is that you have to have an expectation that an action you will take will result in the thing that you want. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. And that's the means. And first of all, the expectation may not always be correct. You may think that an action will result in what you want, but that's not always the case. A great example of that is jokes. You know what I mean? I tell a joke with the desired result being that people give me a weird look, and then kind of there's an awkward silence. But instead, sometimes people laugh and it ruins the whole thing. And so my expectation doesn't always line up with reality, but sometimes I get the awkward silence.
That's That must be really jarring for you when they actually laugh.
It's terrible.
Especially given how infrequent it is. Like, are you sick? What happened? Some nervous tick?
So the next part of this is that it takes time to do things. And so one of the means that you need in order to accomplish whatever your desired end is time. And so time is one of the scarce resources that you allocate in order to achieve your end. And then the next part of this is that all of the resources are scarce. And so whatever it is you want to achieve, there's no unending resource that you can use. And one of the biggest limiting factors you'd think is the physical resources. You'd think when it comes to me getting that Toyota, the biggest limiting factor is the fact that I don't have $40,000. It's actually not true. The biggest limiting factor to me getting that Toyota is time. If time didn't exist, then I could get everything that I wanted. You know what I mean? Because right now, if I wanted to, I could save up for years and years and get that car, right?
Right.
If you get rid of the years and years and everything takes place simultaneously, then I could instantly acquire every single thing that I was willing to work towards. Which is kind of a trippy thought. But that it's time that really limits what we're able to do. And so time actually becomes the most scarce factor in regards to achieving our ends. And it's something we experience every day, because when I wake up, because of time, I can only do one thing at a time. You know what I mean? I can either lay in bed or get up and do the dishes. I cannot do them simultaneously. I can either do the dishes or go eat a snack. I cannot do them both at the same time. And obviously there's multitasking, but multitasking is actually a new means. You know what I mean? Eating a cheeseburger with one hand while trying to wash dishes with the other hand, which anyone can tell you won't be as effective as just eating the cheeseburger. You need to really savor it in order to get the same ends from it. You thought I was going to go the other way and say it's not as effective as using two hands to wash the dishes, didn't you? No. The cheeseburger is the important part here.
I'm stuck in the visual, imagining someone trying to wash dishes with one hand. This just seems difficult. Unless you've got some serious water pressure going on.
I'm thinking, maybe one of those commercial dishwashing stations in a big restaurant kitchen.
There you go. Must have for you one-handed cheeseburger eaters out there.
Hopefully it's a real small one. Okay, so to cap human action, it's purposeful action made by individuals to satisfy their ends or desires with an expectation that a means will achieve that end using scarce means, including time, to prioritize the ends they want the most in order to achieve a better situation for themselves. Anything you want to add to that, Dan?
Just a few thoughts. One of which is that all of this depends on the fact that you can act in the world and get results from it. Right? The fact that the physical world and our engagement in it is what's the word? Maybe consistent enough. It's governed by law enough that you actually can, through trial and error, learn how to accomplish things that will get you closer to what you want. You can imagine a universe in which what you do has a random effect. And you'd give up acting eventually.
Without causality.
Yes, without causality, precisely. Where to move the muscles in my left arm might move the window open instead of moving my left arm or something like that. Where it's
something
just
completely
totally
arbitrary.
irrational. Yes. And at which point action would become a meaningless thing. But the fact that we can affect the world, I've got a 4-month-old baby right now, and he's frantically trying to figure out what on earth does what. Right? He's got desires. He has very little idea of how to satisfy them other than the instinctual, like crying when I'm miserable kind of thing. But then he grows in capacity, and it's it's interesting, the nature of the world we live in. And
yeah, but
you could talk a lot about that.
Even on that small scale, you can see it where the crying is not irrational. There's a clear goal in mind from the crying.
Yes, I'm uncomfortable in some way. Even
I'm
when
hungry, I'm tired,
I'm
gassy, or anything a baby might feel, I guess, too. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just in a weird mood today.
And with that, I'm just kidding. So then you've got, and you could draw a lot of interesting philosophical things. That's one of them. The nature of law in our existence and how we depend on that and being able to interact with things in that way. And other ones, you talked about time. It suggests some things about the philosophy of existentialism, right? This confrontation with the fact that I'm going to die is the confrontation with time, with the limitation of scarce resources, specifically our time, which is really our life, right? All of those things are interesting, and you can build in a variety of ways off of these ideas into all kinds of philosophical things. As you mentioned, Mises focuses a lot on those. Rothbard's going to be more narrowly focused on what we generally think of as economics, and that's what we're going to build up now. Though you could, as I said, go all kinds of directions from here, and it's interesting stuff.
So the next concept we want to talk about in regards to human action is value scales. And value scales are a concept that I am in love with. Something that I've found incredibly useful, not just when looking at economics, but when looking broadly at human action in general. Value scales are a great way to apply the principles of human action. And that's exactly what value scales do, is take everything you learned about human action, that it's a means to achieve an ends, and you'll eventually end up with value scales. And so how you get to that is you have ends that you want to achieve. Most people have an almost infinite number of ends that they want to achieve. There are infinite ends that can be aimed for. You know what I mean? I could desire to slowly, I don't know. I thought of several things and it got surprisingly dark, like me bashing my head through a wall for no reason. And I don't know why my mind went there, but that's an example of an absolutely bizarre and irrational desire that I might have.
Let me step in while Brad slips into madness for a moment. There are a lot of really good ice cream flavors. And among the flavors I've tried, I've probably had 30 or 40 good ice cream flavors across the course of my life. You know, some of them are variations on the same flavor with subtle differences.
But they're still different, yeah.
But they're still different, right? If you wanted to taste the best ice cream, what are the limits of that single thing alone, right? like what kinds of ice cream could you end up settling on as your end, as the thing that does that? You could, in terms of like desires for what makes someone happy in life, you know, having good friends, having good relationships, and you could get into the specifics of the goals that you have there, the ends that you have there. There's really, and obviously you don't, and I'm just talking good things. You can aim for anything, right? Aim is something
expressed.
that, as Brad has already initially shown us in shocking manner, you can aim for all kinds of things, right? So the aims are ultimately, infinite, though you could certainly argue that there are a finite number of good ones, or at least a finite number of good directions that you could go for aims. But
you could argue there's a finite number of good generalities, but in specific ends, they definitely have to be infinite, because even when you start talking about ice cream, there are an infinite number of ways that you can create variety just within the world of ice cream.
Yes, let alone something as complicated as relationships or.
So, and then there are an infinite number of means we can use to achieve those ends. So as you were saying, Dan, you know, your goal is to have the most delicious ice cream. There are many different ways you can go about trying to achieve that goal. And based off of the knowledge that you have, the experience that you have, the environment that you're in, the way you go about to achieve that's going to be different.
Yes, and it's hard not to conflate means and ends, because sometimes you're aiming for the means specifically, which is why it can be somewhat interchangeable. A good end that often people live for is they want a good life, broadly speaking, and what does that look like, and how is that achieved? What are the means to that is a very, very interesting question. Maybe you'd come up with some things that are in common, but obviously there's an infinite configuration there.
No, which is why in practical terms, when we talk about ends, we're usually focused on the specifics. Generally, I want to have a good life. Yeah. But
Aristotle would say generally people want to be happy.
Yeah, they want to be happy, and I want to be happy too. But specifically, when I wake up and the impetus for me getting out of bed is not me
for a specific action.
I want to be happy today, and that's why I'm getting out of bed. I'm thinking, I need to record a podcast today, so I'm going to get out of bed. I'd like to sleep another hour, but I'd rather record a podcast. And this is where we get into an interesting idea, because there are an infinite number of ends and means, but there's a finite amount of time. We have to make choices, right? Because we can't do all of those things. And so what we do is, consciously or unconsciously, we weigh all of the options that we have against each other and determine what's at the top of the list. And it's not like we're visualizing a list every time. But when I choose to get out of bed, I'm putting getting out of bed above anything else I could have done in that specific situation. So it wasn't a choice between getting out of bed or riding a bike, because I can't ride a bike in bed. It wasn't choosing to get out of bed or going fishing, because I can't fish while in bed. I don't have that skill set. So it's limited by your situation. You know what I mean? When I'm getting out of bed, I'm not choosing against everything that's happening in the world in that moment. No, I'm just choosing about what else I could have done. I could have stayed in bed. I could have rolled out of bed. I could have started screaming at the top of my lungs while pounding my fists into my pillow. You know what I mean? There are so many things I could have done besides get out of bed within that limited realm.
Yes. And you mentioned that consciously or unconsciously, we're weighing these things. And we're not necessarily suggesting that you're weighing, that somehow your mind is able to take into account all of the possibilities in that given moment. It's just the possibilities before you, right? The possibilities that you are aware of. Yeah, you're limited to some degree by your knowledge there.
There's a reason creative people are valued for their creativity, because they're able to think of goals that we didn't think of, and that expands our opportunities.
Yeah, ends and means that are beyond what.
Yeah, because if I can't think of an incredibly clever way to get out of bed, I won't use that. You know what I mean? I could be doing something really awesome instead of just getting out of bed like I normally do, and I just haven't thought of it yet. Hopefully I will soon.
Hopefully you will. Please inform me.
Soon I'm going to be somersaulting out of bed every morning. And I'll be like, man, I could have been doing this my whole life.
It's interesting. I hear people discuss things often people talk about market decisions within a context of perfect rationality and perfect knowledge. And I just wonder what world they're talking about, because it's not this world, that's for sure.
No, and that's a great point to clarify that. Yeah, in this Austrian economic way of viewing things, we're not saying that you're viewing all the possible ends. You don't have that perfect knowledge. You don't have perfect rationality. You may choose irrational things, and you may not be able to think of the best possible outcomes, but given what you are thinking of, or unconsciously thinking of, because often I don't decide to get out of bed, I just do it because of, habit and routine, and I understand that I do want to get out of bed more than stay in bed, and so I don't even have to make that conscious decision, even though I'm making that decision every day.
Right.
It doesn't change the fact that it's a decision because I could stop if I wanted to. I'm not stuck in this rut where it's impossible for me to not get out of bed when I choose to. You know what I mean?
I think by rational here, what we mean is attempting causality, right? It's trying to go from, it's trying to use a means to achieve an end. It's this value scale is the way by which you go from the possible to a specific action, right? You've considered consciously or unconsciously, and you have to do something, even if it's continue doing what you're doing. And so you prioritize, and that priority ends up with something at the top that you do. And often I say something at the top and I immediately think of when my wife can't decide between two food places. Everyone's been asked, what do you want to eat? And you're like, this or this or this, and it's all fine. You don't really have a strong preference. And that doesn't interfere with the fact that you do want to eat, and that the means, there's various
means. That's a great
means that are
example
fine.
because you'll quickly realize that value scales are very complicated and they're not ironclad. Because I can tell you right now, having been involved in many of those conversations, that there are many things you can do to shift someone's value scales. And that's often why people are vague about what they want, is because their decision is going to be based off of what you want. So let's say we got a couple, it's me and my wife. My wife has several places that she wants. And if it were just her going to get food, she would not be paralyzed by indecision. She would just go to Chick-fil-A. But because we're going to get food together, her value scales have shifted from Chick-fil-A at the top to Chick-fil-A might be at the top, or it might be something else because she wants to make me happy at the same time. And so if I say I want Chipotle, then she'll be like, great, Chick-fil-A's back at the top, you get Chipotle, I'll get Chick-fil-A. But if I say Five Guys, then now Five Guys is at the top because she'd rather go get Five Guys with me than get Chick-fil-A by herself. And so it becomes this complicated mental algorithm that takes place, and we have a little conversation to then resort the algorithm based off of what the two of us want. And of course, in her case, it's not always Chick-fil-A, but it's easier for this example to have it just be Chick-fil-A. But anyways, and so what we have is a value scale that is constantly shifting and is not always ironclad, but is fluid based off of, even our passing cravings. You know what I mean? I'm not stable in what I want, but at any given moment, I do want something, which is the only reason I act. If we didn't have value scales, as in something that we valued above other things, we would never act.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned the things about affecting people's value scales. These things are far from set in stone. They're influenced by little details like how difficult the means is. If I can, you take into account a certain action in connection to its means as one thing. So you're not just saying, do I want to eat this food more than this food? It's, do I want to go through the trouble of acquiring it?
Yes. Do I want to travel 25 minutes and wait in line this long to get the food? Do I have to leave my car? How much is it going to cost, in terms of dollars on top of all these other means?
Right. All of this is filtered through this to give you a kind of ordering where you go, I'd rather do this than this. And sometimes you can't really figure out. You're like, both of those have their issues, and someone can persuade you. And when you're saying both of those have their issues, what you're suggesting is that actually, given these two choices, inaction right now or not choosing is actually the preferable thing. You'd rather not choose than not do one of those things. And so actually the highest thing on the scale, if you had to describe it, would be remaining as you are until you have further information.
And in social situations, that's often a desirable end because you don't want to be responsible for what the group is doing. And so inaction is an end in and of itself.
Yes, and it's not really, depending on how you define inaction, you could say that there really is ultimately no inaction, right? There's no,
because it's just a
unchosen thing. Yeah.
We could call it subtle action. Inaction is really subtle action.
Or continued action or something, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense socially for the reasons you were saying with your wife. I can relate.
And it's something that I see in all social interactions is there's this counterplay, and that's what part of the feelers are when you have that conversation, is to try and understand where people are at so that you can properly calibrate things. But usually people don't think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But in its core, a value scale could be easily illustrated by having a hierarchy of things that you want, you know, like if you were talking candy bars, you know, you could have Snickers at the top and then Butterfinger and then, you know, Reese's, Fast Break, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And
did you say Milky Way? Did you just ignore the best candy bar, or was that in there?
Hold on. Pause the
Everybody
episode.
Stop.
Keep listening, but hold on. Milky Way is your favorite candy bar?
It's gotta be top 3 for sure.
Well, what are the two that are obviously above it? I mean, like, I get it. You just told me it's in third place. Like, obviously, Snickers is above it because Snickers is a Milky Way,
is not above
but with an amazing crunch to it with those peanuts.
Snickers is what happens when you run out of the good stuff and you had to fill in other things in the Milky Way.
Why couldn't you be there through my childhood for trick or treating so I would have
traded all the
Milky
Snickers
Ways
for the Milky Ways.
Snickers, yeah.
What about Three Musketeers? Man's up there for sure.
Three Musketeers is good.
I love the 100 grand Carmelo. These are.
Wow, you are
at.
out there with your candy choices. That's wild.
Now, Reese's is up there high too.
Now let me be clear. I didn't say Reese's. I said Reese's Fast Break. It's a different bar. It's a different candy.
That's true. That is a different candy.
It's way better than Reese's. Reese's is fine, but the Reese's Fast Break is basically like a Snickers bar, but peanut butter flavored. Oh, so good. Anyways. So the other thing that's great about value scales is once you start talking in value scales, you can start judging other people's value scales.
And that's the long-term goal of all of this.
Is to judge people. Is to say, no, Milky Way should not be up there. It's not even that I don't like Milky Way. There are better candies. I like all candy. Well, there's a couple really nasty ones, but I like almost all candy. Anyways, back to the value scales. You know, so you've got your list of candy bars, and there's a few important things. Number one, this is obviously your list as demonstrated by the difference between me and Dan. This is your individual hierarchy of things that you desire in the realm of candy. So it's specific to an environment. It's even more specific because you notice I didn't list candy bars on there that you've never heard of that you can't get access to. Nestle Toll House cookie dough candy bars were a limited time candy a couple decades ago, maybe 15 years ago, that are no longer available, that are on my list always, but they're inaccessible, and so I never get them. You know what I mean?
There's some German candy bars. Holy cow.
No, see, exactly. There's so many things that are on the list. And so really, when I make a candy bar list, I've got a dream list, but then there's a list of when I go to the store, what's actually available. And so when I go to the store, I start looking down my list. Okay, these candies never existed. These candies no longer exist. And then these candies exist but aren't here. And then finally, top of my list, these candies are here. That's the one that I get, you know?
And your mood at that moment, right?
Oh,
maybe
yes,
at that moment you're not feeling some particular option.
Sorry, I was already factoring that in with my fluid value scale.
Yes.
Because in that moment, there are other candies I'm craving that aren't there or are no longer made. Or have never existed, but I wish they did.
Yes,
you know?
Or are there and you're just not feeling in the moment, right? You exactly. Just had one recently or something.
Which rarely stops me.
Right. So this theoretical, what are my top 5, even the practical top 5 that are going to be there at the store, you might not choose number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because the actual value scale, the one that matters, is not some abstraction that you've planned out ahead of time.
It's not some list you keep in a drawer.
No. Your actual value scale, the important one that fuels your actual decisions, is only ever solid in that moment as you make the choice.
When you choose it, yes.
It's ephemeral and it has to be ephemeral in that way because it takes into account the things at the time. And it takes into account one candy bar, right? This is the term here is, marginal utility.
Yeah. Which we haven't talked about yet.
Which we haven't talked about. And it's painful. I hate the term, but
it's super important because
the concept is.
Because the question might be, well, how long does this list need to be? This list needs to be for the candy bars, however many candy bars you choose to buy. So if you buy one candy bar, then in that moment, your value scale is really a two-tiered value scale, which is this candy bar above all other candy bars. End of list. But if you're getting 2 candy bars, now that list by definition has to grow. Okay, do I want a second of that same candy bar or something else? And on that margin is where the ephemeral becomes concrete. And that's what Dan means by marginal utility. And so as you go down the list, your list becomes concrete as your cart fills up with candy bars, which we've all been there.
Yeah, by marginal here, we mean essentially, by marginal utility, we mean the value of the next one. Right? The how you're weighting the next one item. And as you said, buying one is one thing. Now, you'd think that you would just buy 2 of the top thing, no? Of course not.
Yeah, if that's the thing you value the most.
Yeah, right. If what we were saying is, this is the greatest candy bar to me, then clearly I should just get more of that. But no, having one changes things. Having one may make it so that I actually want something else that complements it, right? Or I want some kind of new thing. So even within this process, by purchasing 2, my list is going to shift for that second tier, as Brad was suggesting, for the second choice. It might be something else.
And the great thing about this is that it's not something that as economists you have to have figured out. It's not something that even as individuals you have to have figured out. It's simply valuable as a concept to understand how people are operating. It's to understand that in the moment people are making these choices based off of what they value. And it's abstract, and it's not in terms of dollars, and it's not in terms of objective value. It's subjective, personal valuation. A great example of this, there's always the theoretical discussion of bread versus platinum. That in any given situation, people would choose a bar of platinum, which is an incredibly valuable metal, versus a loaf of bread, which costs, $2 or $3, or maybe $7 by the time you hear this podcast in a couple days. But still much cheaper than platinum. And so you choose the platinum. But generally, bread is more important than platinum because bread keeps us alive. You know what I mean? That if we had to choose between platinum or bread as a society, we might be better off with bread.
Certainly. Generally speaking, I'd say.
No, and health experts could argue about the value of bread versus other things, but bread is a concept. You know what I mean? Food versus precious metals. We always choose precious metals in the instance, but food is actually what we need. But it's because you're not actually measuring them as concepts. You're measuring them in the moment. That specifically, would you rather have this loaf of bread when you're next to a store where you can buy as much bread as you want, or this bar of platinum that you can take to the pawn shop, get several $100s for, and then buy as much bread as you want, plus who knows what else? Obviously, people will choose the platinum. And depending on the situation, that may change. You're starving in the desert, you may choose the bread over the platinum. There's no way for you to sell it, you know what I mean? Et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And to determine that value, as you were saying, requires the circumstance. To sit and say, what is the objective value of platinum is a fool's errand, because it's actually beyond our ability to calculate. I mean, what would that even mean? We'd have to say to whom, in what circumstances? What are their ends? Right? What would this serve? And these are the kind of things that, as you said, it's ultimately the value scale highlights the subjectivity of value in all things. Not subjectivity in that it's arbitrary, but subjectivity in that it it is, you can't consider it without reference to the subject. We're not using subjective as the opposite of truth. Right?
No, not at all.
Sometimes people go, objective is truth, subjective is opinion. That's that's not the distinction here.
No,
we're talking objective. In fact, it can be viewed from any perspective, subjective from the eye of the beholder.
Opposite, because we're arguing that how people objectively view bread and platinum is in many ways inaccurate, but what is totally accurate is how they view them personally in the moment. That's truth.
Yes. Ironically enough, these are subjective truths. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. And that's what, when you look at, you see numbers like market value of an item, right? The reason we would pick platinum over bread in a normal day of our normal American first world lives is because, we know the market value is going to be much higher.
And Dan, what is that's that actually value? A great segue to talking about exchange, because that's the next logical progression from value scales is the reason to value platinum, and that's exchanging things that you have for things that you want.
Yeah. Turns out I don't craft with platinum. I don't make jewelry. I don't even that I can't consume it. I have no use for platinum.
I make little brick houses with the bars. You know, I just build a little house.
You just stack them
like Legos.
Who knew
you could sell them?
I would like to see one. And
people keep offering them to me for bread. So what do you do? And I'm like, well, I value platinum more than bread. Problem
This is great
solved.
Building material. I love these toys.
Sorry. So anyways, exchange. So how exchange works is really quite simple. You have your value scale of candy bars. You also have...
Your Halloween example is great.
Yeah, let's go to the Halloween example. I have my value scale. Dan has his value scale. I have Milky Ways and Snickers. Dan has Milky Ways and Snickers. What's inevitably going to happen? I'm going to end up with more Snickers, and Dan's going to end up with more Milky Ways. Is that going to happen because I'm stealing from Dan and Dan's stealing from me? Possibly. But hopefully, the logical thing is that I value Snickers much higher than Milky Way, and Dan values Milky Way much higher than Snickers, and we start trading. Does that mean we trade every single one of those two candies until we each have a full pile of the one? Absolutely not.
No. I'm going to say, I want at least one Snickers.
Yeah, exactly. Just because I prefer Snickers, what matters is the marginal utility. When I have 2 Snickers and 6 Milky Ways, you better believe I'm going to trade. But what about when I have 7 Snickers and 1 Milky Way? I'm going to be like, I still enjoy that caramel and nougat taste without the peanuts. And so I'd like to keep this one kind of as an homage to the Mars Company and their origins with the Mars bar and the history that goes behind this candy bar. Yes, I will keep one of these Milky Ways that used to be called Mars bars. And there we would go. And so I would stop trading. But that's only if Dan was willing to trade that much with me. If he only had 2 Snickers and 2 Milky Ways, once he trades those 2 Snickers, he can't trade anymore. And so I may not even get there.
Yeah. So I might get down to 3 Snickers and 5 Milky Ways and be like, I really like Milky Ways and Brad has more of those, but 5 Milky Ways, I think I'm set. I'm going to go find somebody who has some $100,000 and I'm going to see if they're going to take a Snickers.
Trade those Snickers. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I can go find some other option.
And that's voluntary exchange. That's exactly what me and my siblings would do is we would organize all of our candy. We'd prioritize. And of course, in this case, our value scales would actually be conscious and listed. Like we'd be thinking, I want these candies and I really want to get rid of these. And we'd start trading with each other until we achieved equilibrium. And that's it. That's voluntary exchange in its most basic form. It's beautiful. It's something I really enjoy. Especially
since you worked your rear off to get that candy, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You've got a pretty good haul. But then through exchange, you can at times go from having a lot of what you want to having a ton of what you want. You can go from like a 4 out of 10, like this is way better than where I was at the beginning of the day with a 1 out of 10, and get to a 10 out of 10 through just trading. And that turns out to be much easier legwork, right? You didn't have to go in any houses. You just sat there on the floor and you got to enjoy the anticipation of the candy.
No, and Dan, that's such a fantastic concept because of how value scales work. The only reason you're going to engage in voluntary exchange is because you want what you're getting more than what you're giving up. In other words, you value
purposeful
it more
action.
Highly.
Yeah,
So,
purposeful action that you've chosen over other options.
Exactly. So as a result of every single voluntary exchange, you're better off than you were before the exchange. Otherwise, you wouldn't have made the exchange. And that right there is such a key concept in Austrian economics and is one of the key components of being in favor of a free market, is the idea that if you don't want the exchange and it's voluntary, then you won't make the exchange. But if you want the exchange and it's voluntary, then you're doing it because you believe you're going to be better off. It doesn't mean you're actually going to be better off, but it means that you're acting because you have that belief. And that goes back to the perfect rationality and the perfect knowledge. You know, often when I'm engaged in voluntary exchange, I do something because I think it's my best option, but then I realize it's not my best option. I trade for all these Snickers from Dan, and then I realize, oh snap, I didn't realize this whole time that Joe over here hates Snickers, and he would have given me 2 Snickers for every one of my Milky Ways. And so I would have gotten much more if I had traded with Joe, which I didn't realize because I didn't have the knowledge. Dan wasn't lying to me. I just didn't realize there was someone else, and I could have taken the time and gotten more of what I wanted. It doesn't change. That doesn't change the fact that I'm better off trading with Dan than if I hadn't traded at all.
Right. Just because your life wasn't you didn't optimize it to really maximize how much you could get out of it. Doesn't mean you're better off. So often when people are like, man, that was a really bad deal. I got cheated. What they mean is they were less better off than they could have been. But they're still better off. Yeah. They're still getting something. They've still made the choice because the choice made them better off. And it seemed at the time with the information they had to be the best, to be the right option.
Yeah. And in that situation, and this is one of the key components, is that if I'm a third party looking in that situation, the best thing I can do for Brad is give him knowledge. It's not to coerce any of these parties, but it's rather to give everyone in the situation as much knowledge as possible so they can make the best decisions. Because I can't give them more rationality. You know what I mean? But I can give them knowledge. And if I start using coercion, then I stop them from making the voluntary exchanges that allow them to be better off.
Yeah, you could even act on their behalf if they want you to, right? You can help them negotiate. You can do stuff like that.
Yeah. There's all sorts of things I can do to add value without interrupting that voluntary exchange.
Yeah, because as soon as you interrupt the voluntary exchange, the assumption is that you are then if it's going to happen voluntarily, you wouldn't need to coerce it. So if you're coercing it, it's because it wasn't going to happen voluntarily, and because you're stepping in and on someone's value scale, you're overriding what they see as the best decision for them, right? By definition, through coercion, you are automatically making a worse decision for them.
Yeah, you're reducing the value those parties would have had from the exchange. You're either reducing it or eliminating it, depending on what you're doing.
Yes, you can actually cause harm. And this is important because sometimes this is justified, right? Especially if the person themselves is not engaging in voluntary exchange, a thief, a robber, a murderer, and so on, right? At that point, we go, yeah, this is going to harm them to throw them in jail. Yeah. But it's also going to prevent harm, right? It's also going to do these other things. But when you do that in a free exchange, you're automatically decreasing for one of the parties, the perceived value that they're going to get out of it. Otherwise, they would do it willingly, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have to coerce them.
And so this brings us to the real world, and the real world has a few more elements. One of the ones we want to go over real quick is the introduction of money. Money, surprisingly, doesn't change this game at all. It just makes it easier. Because what money does is it allows me to prioritize my candy choices every day without needing to have other people who have candy and me having candy to exchange in order to get my most valued candy. Instead, what I can do is, instead of laboring on Halloween night, knocking on doors to get candy, I labor at a company in exchange for dollars that I can then use to purchase candy. And let me tell you, going from a kid with no money to a kid with money, oh man, the world was my burrito. I looked out and I was like, I can buy whatever candy I want. No trades. I just take the dollars and I can just start at the top of my list. And guess what? Walgreens has that candy and I'll just go over and buy it, and then work my way down that value scales. And it was fantastic. And that's what money does. It's a game changer in terms of our ability to trade. And this also introduces a whole nother idea, which is labor, which we haven't talked about, which is that I'm using my time and my skills and my resources in exchange for the things that I want, just like you did on Halloween night. But now it's indirectly in exchange for money that I then use for all the things that I want. And thus we have an economy. But at its core, an economy is just this voluntary exchange taking place billions of times over and over and over again. And this is where intervention starts to look even more crazy. Because when you see three people who are exchanging candy with each other, you can think, hey, I know better than them. And so I can step in and theoretically, if I'm more rational than they are and have more knowledge than they are, actually make things better for them than they could make for themselves. Now, of course, I think it's arrogant that person thinks that they're more rational and more knowledgeable than those three people. But theoretically, that could be possible. I mean, it's something that parents will do with children, is step in and say, I know better than you. I have more knowledge, and so I'm going to step in and I'm going to actually choose for you, which is something I do when I stop my kid from running into the street.
Yeah, let me just highlight one thing before you move into the bigger example. The person intervening can't have access to some of the knowledge about the value scales that the subject can.
They truly cannot. Thank you for clarifying that.
There are certain things, they may have a lot of knowledge about things, and they may know the subject better than themselves, right? With a parent and a child, this is often the case. And they may know, they may be looking at consequences an hour down the road that the child just simply isn't anticipating. But there is simply some information they cannot access because it is at the level of the subject's internal mind and motivations and wants and desires and things. And you're always, even as a parent with a small child, to some degree, you're playing with fire there because there's just going to be some things you don't know. Right. Mm-hmm. And often your child can't communicate them either. Yeah. So I know I've tried to help and it seemed very clear that I was helping and
which ended is part of why parenting is such a bear.
It's very difficult. You try hard.
So even if those three actors were adults who had divulged a ton of information about their desires, as you were saying, Dan, it's impossible to accurately predict their actual valuations. But even then, theoretically, it's possible that you could have enough outside information and more rationality than them that you could step in that one specific situation, and the result would be that things would be better for all three of those people. And that, at its core, is the idea behind government, is that we can step in because we have more rationality or more knowledge, and we can make better decisions. And on a small scale, it's iffy. But on a large scale, it's not just that it's iffy or that it's morally incorrect, which it is. And we've talked about those reasons before, and we'll talk about them again. We're very clear about when we believe government intervention is justified. But purely from an economic standpoint, in terms of practicalities about how the world works. When you're talking about billions of voluntary exchanges that are taking place, often on a daily basis, the ability to correctly, I mean, at this point, we're talking guess or approximate the value scales of everyone involved in those exchanges just simply doesn't work. A great example of this is that when the government tries to intervene in the economy, they often look at how much money people are making. And that's just, and they talk about that like it's everything, and that itself is hard for them to track. But the fact of the matter is that money is just one small part of my life. I am not just the dollars that I make and the dollars that I spend. There's so much more going on in my life that you have to calculate. You know what I mean? And we've talked about this before, about how there's so many things in our lives that aren't just money. And that's true not just for what's happening in my life, but also for my desires. You know what I mean? When I'm desiring where I want to work, it's not just about the money that I'm making. It's about the work that I'm doing, you know, like specifically what I'm doing, the effect that work is having on other people. So like a cause that you're working towards, you know, people become doctors because they want to help people. And so if they're not helping people, they're not going to be as happy with their work, even if they're making more money. The effect that it has on me physically, psychologically, you know, it could be, you know, physically difficult work. It could be backbreaking work. It could be psychologically demanding, et cetera, down the line. You know, the coworkers that I have, the time that it takes up, the time of day, you know, the time it's taking away from my family, how far away it is from where I live. All of these are just a ton of factors that specifically revolve around my career, right? And so just trying to increase the money that I make is not going to take a look at all those other factors. And so the government could step in and say, hey, Brad, you're making this much. Well, we want you to be making double that. And so now you're going to be doing this. It's like, boom, Brad is now twice as well off as he was before, because money is all that they're seeing. But the fact of the matter is there's so much more in terms of my value scales that aren't just money. And so you could very easily put me in a job where I'm making twice as much and I'm much worse off.
Make your life worse.
And I know that because I've had the opportunity to make more than I'm making now. I mean, starting from when I went to college, I intentionally set myself on a path of making less money. I looked at the college degrees that were out there, and there were so many that could make a ridiculous amount of money, and I didn't choose them for a myriad number of reasons. I mean, going from what I'm good at to what I like to do to et cetera, the time it would take, all of these factors I looked at and chose less money in exchange for other non-money things that I valued.
All of which factor into your well-being, all of which factor into your I guess your happiness per se.
My happiness
is a shorthand for all of the value,
not
things,
as someone outside sees it. And that's the thing, is it's going to be different for everyone. There are a ton of people who get amazing satisfaction, I assume, I hope, from being doctors and nurses and people in the medical field, and they make good money as well. And that's just, and I can't do it. I can't do it because, right. I mean, I almost faint at the sight of blood. I can't stand any of the icky body stuff. I hate the mathematical stuff. I hate the biological aspect of it. There's so much that I don't like. Before I even get to the cost of schooling and the time commitments, there's so many obstacles between me and that it's just not going to happen. And that's okay, because we all have different desires. And I'm so glad that people desire it. I don't know if they're insane or what happened in their brain, but I'm so happy for them. I'm so happy they're making all of that money. It's just not me. And I mean that. It sounds sarcastic, but it's sincere, because if everyone had the same value scales as me, the world would be a much darker place. Because
we learned that earlier this episode.
No,
something about bashing.
There's only a few specific things in terms of the infinite number of desires and ends that are my top things. And so there were so many things that would fall by the wayside because I don't care about them, but someone else does. And that's what's so amazing. You know what I mean? There are people who put time and effort into posting factual, useful information on Wikipedia for free because they get value from it. And I get value from it. And we're all better off because they have those desires. And that's fantastic. And we need to have that infinite range of desires to have such a full, rich world that we do, ranging from doctors to Wikipedia entries to whatever I contribute. And when we figure it out, we'll be happy to let you guys know.
Candy bar rankings.
It's candy bar rankings.
See, it's not nothing. I know that's what you were thinking, but
I knew it wasn't nothing. It just didn't have quite the ring of Wikipedia entries or doctors, so I just thought I'd leave it nebulous.
Your point is, there's just no way to generate concepts of value beyond this process. And there's no way to navigate those beyond beyond consent. How would you know that I valued something if I didn't consent to it? How could you possibly know that? In fact, if I'm refusing consent, wouldn't that tell you that I don't value it? Wouldn't that tell you that this is not good for me?
No, and there's
no other way to navigate
voluntary exchange
that.
It's so useful as not an indicator, but an absolute proof that you value one thing more than another because you're willing to exchange it. Because if you're not willing to exchange it, then maybe you really don't value that thing more, even if you say that you do. Because lots of people will say that they value money more than all these other things, but they refuse to exchange those things for that money.
Right. And it's also why if you're asking people what they want, that's not a good list of what they actually want, right?
Yeah,
well, you actually need to look at what they do rather than what they say, because what they say can be, everyone has wish lists, right? Everyone has things that they would want in an ideal world, assuming no effort or cost is required, which is not the world we live in, right? Which is why they don't have it, otherwise they would. It's just interesting. There's so much that could be said from here. We could go into terms of, as we said, consent there. I suggested some of the ideas there, and there's a lot of philosophy, moral philosophy, as well as economics that can stem from this way of viewing the world and this perspective, this idea of subjective value and these value scales by which we navigate a world of infinite complexity and choose means to accomplish ends that we also choose, right? The ends that we want. It's just it's a very human world. It's human action. And this is the basis of Austrian economics. Mm-hmm. From here, you can get to all other economic ideas. And you go, well, where's to make one slight comparison here as we wrap up to other philosophies, where is the math equation? I don't know. How do you generate a math equation out of human action?
Yeah. And you don't need a math equation to understand human action, because using these principles, I can go out and look at what's going on in the economy and make sense of it. Not perfectly, but I can come up with theories. I can use logic to weigh those theories and come up with useful ways of viewing the world when economists waste time making mathematical formulas that may or may not have bearing on reality. Yes,
where the mathematical formulas are useful is when you are trying to say, okay, so what is happening in the world? And then you can try and you need some statistical modeling and data and things like that. And then you can see how that stacks up against the theory and things. But
yeah, we're not saying that we're against data. Absolutely.
No, but you aren't going to be able to create a mathematical model that's predictive. Because how could you predict the outcome of people acting in the world in this manner, right? You can't. This is the physics envy we talked about last episode. Mm-hmm. You are not going to be able to model this in a way that allows you to say, this is how much inflation is going to go up, or this is how much this is going to cost, or this is how many of these are going to be sold, right? These are things that are impossible actually to predict. And it's impossible because hopefully you can see why, having built up how people act with purpose to achieve ends, and in a very complicated world, and they're always acting at the margin. They're always acting at the next item, and it shifts even after they have won, right? You can't even say, well, shoes are worth this much to this person. Even if you knew that absolutely, you wouldn't know what they're worth after they have one pair of shoes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. To some people, they're still worth a lot. They collect shoes, right? To some people, it's one pair is good. They'll patch it over the course of their life or whatever. It's just people are so interesting and of such infinite variety and complexity that it's, hopefully this perspective, the kind of modeling that we're used to, seems a little bit more silly.
Okay, so here we are. We've talked about human action, which is purposeful action that individual humans use, means that are limited to achieve ends, which therefore, by definition, limits their ends. Because their ends have to be limited, and there are so many ends out there, every individual has value scales that allows them to prioritize what they want most. Those value scales are subjective, they're individual, and they're fluid based off of their desires at any given moment, and they don't become concrete until they actually act. And that's where we get into marginal utility, is the valuation of the next thing on their list versus something else. This, of course, leads people to engage in voluntary exchange, exchanging what they have for what they want more than what they have. And that includes not only exchanging goods, but exchanging their labor and their talents for goods or for money they can use to get goods. And all of that is what underlies the economy in every given moment. The economy is simply exchange taking place over and over and over again as people work to better themselves. That's the base. And there are a few things that we need to cover before we want to take that and apply that to inflation and greedflation and what's going on right now. One of those core things we want to talk about is production. Production is not just us exchanging labor for goods, but us actually exchanging labor for more means that allows us to get what we want. And that's something we haven't talked about yet. And that results in what is called capital. And we haven't talked about any of that. And we need to talk about time preference, which affects when we want things, which affects things like interest rates. It affects things like investment and savings. And all of that actually affects inflation. And so those are a few things we want to cover. There may be a few more. We'll probably want to cover the supply of money again or not. We've talked about it before, but those few more concepts that are really pivotal to building these base elements and applying them to the inflation crisis that we're having today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pause one more time. If this is going on too much and we're talking too much about Austrian economics, feel free to shoot us a message. But otherwise, we're going to keep plugging ahead because we think this is actually useful to what's being talked about today. And we want to take the time to do it right. And so we're going to talk about those few more concepts and then actually apply them to the greedflation that's taking place. And that will all be in the next episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thank you all for listening. And actually, it won't be next week, guys. Dan is actually going to be out of town, so you may have to wait 2 weeks, but we will be back. Next episode, we'll continue discussing this. Sit tight. It's a-coming. Thanks for your patience, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good one, guys.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.